Introducing the next session speaker, Professor Kingsley Moghalu. Kingsley Moghalu is a global leader who has made contributions to the stability, progress, and wealth of nations, societies, and individuals across such domains as academia, economic policy, banking and finance, entrepreneurship, law, and diplomacy. As Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria from 2009 to 2014, he led the execution of extensive reforms in the Nigerian banking system after the global financial crisis. He was a member of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee that brought inflation down into single digits. He is the founder and CEO of Sogato Strategies LLC, a global strategy, risk, and macroeconomic advisory firm that has helped multinational corporations, global banks, private equity, and asset management corporations make successful investments in emerging market countries. Kingsley previously worked for the United Nations for 17 years, leading successful work in national reconciliation and nation building in fractured societies, risk management, and management reform in the UN. Kingsley was educated at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and the Institute of Risk Management in London, UK. He is a visionary thinker and thought leader and has authored several books. Professor Moghalu is an international keynote speaker at industry conferences and a frequent commentator in the global media space. A philanthropist, Kingsley founded the Isaac Moghalu Foundation, a non-profit organization that provides support for literacy, educational institutions, and access to education for underprivileged children in rural communities in Nigeria. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Kingsley Moghalu.
Excellent. Prof, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah. Thank you, Oliver. Distinguished alums of the College of Immaculate Conception, compatriots, previous speakers, Ike Chioke, Chichi and Agolo. I hope I've not forgotten anyone, but it's my great pleasure and honor to be here with you and to say a few words as your keynote speaker today about shock-proofing education in Nigeria. I'd like to begin with a story. It's sometime in 2012. My wife, Mary Ann Moghalu, was at a school in the slums of Abuja called the LEA Primary School in Gishiri. And she was surveying the scene in this school. There were about 50 kids cramped in a small space. The floor was earthen. The roof was sinking. There were no toilet facilities. And, you know, she was just very downcast. And she told me the story when she came back home. And we really were very touched with what she saw. Now, she's the CEO of the Isaac Moghalu Foundation, which was referred to in my introduction, the philanthropy, the foundation we established in memory of my late father. So what IMOF, the Isaac Moghalu Foundation, then did was to intervene in the LEA school in Gishiri. We constructed a modern classroom block with 3 classrooms. We put in a borehole for water supply in the school. We built toilet facilities, and then we established a program to stock the library of the LEA school in Gishiri with books donated by Regent Primary School, where my daughter was in Abuja, an upscale private school in Abuja. Now, you know, so with this story, you see the state of education in Nigeria and how a private foundation had to intervene in just one school, one small school. So there is room for philanthropy, but the government and the state must still do the heavy lifting for education in Nigeria, for public education in Nigeria. What is the state of education? And of course, I know that in speaking at this stage, of course, instead of speaking upfront at the beginning of the program, I run the risk that I may address certain things that have been said by previous speakers. But that's okay, and I hope you'll forgive me. And before I go on, of course, I want to congratulate the CIC alums for the great work you've done. You've shown yourself a model for how alums can intervene in their school, and even bringing in friends of alums, business associates of alums. I think that's just very innovative, and you've made a huge impact. That accords with a model we see a lot in American universities, American high schools, and so on. So, and you've made a lot of progress rather than waiting for the government. You've taken up the job yourself, and you've done very well. So congratulations. Let me begin by talking broadly about the state of education in Nigeria. It's in a state of disrepair, and therefore it's in a state of despair. I think we can all agree. Nigeria today has the highest numbers of out-of-school children in the world, about 13 million. We have 174 universities in Nigeria. 43 of them are federal universities, 48 are state universities, 79 are private universities. And I think this is an indication of something. It's an indication of the collapse of public education and a shift towards private education, with very important implications for educational equity in Nigeria. So many schools, as we know in Nigeria today, completely unconducive for learning, very weak infrastructure, as I indicated in my opening presentation. Teachers are poorly paid, and most importantly, the teachers are unqualified. That's the biggest problem that we have. The academic performance of the children is very poor. And this means we have half-baked graduates and half-baked graduates. And that what this means is that we have a society of weak skills, weak thinking, and unemployable graduates who don't have the kinds of skills that they need to be productive in society, even though they are supposed to have been getting an education. And then you have the problem of corruption in the educational system, corruption in the examining bodies, corruption in the students, exam malpractice. And so you just see the fiber of education has collapsed. Let's look at the ratio. If you come to tertiary education and you look at the ratio of lecturers to students, you have the University of Abuja, 1 lecturer to 122 students in average. You have the Lagos State University, 1 lecturer to 144 on average. And then you want to compare that with a university, for example, like Harvard, where the average is 1 lecturer to 4 students. You want to compare that to MIT, 1 lecturer to 9 students. You want to compare that to the University of Cambridge, 1 lecturer to 3 students. Or you want to compare that with the National University of Singapore, 1 lecturer to 10 students. So all in all, what this tells us is that the state of education in Nigeria is just catastrophically bad. It's a national emergency, and I heard Chiche talk about a Marshall Plan for education. Nothing less is called for, and we will come to that in a minute when I begin to talk about what should be done. So with this foundation, we can all agree it's a horrible situation. The question is, I want to talk about, you see, because you can't solve a problem, and this is typical of my approach to public life in Nigeria. You can't solve a problem if you do not understand the problem, or if you understand the problem merely at a very surface level. Of course, we all know there's a problem with education, but many people sometimes miss the depth, the essence of why this is so important, why it's so foundational, and why it's so consequential for our future. And I want to talk about the concept, number one, the whole concept of worldviews. Every society that has advanced, every society that is prosperous, every society that is strong and resilient is driven by a philosophical worldview. And the key to that philosophical worldview is the educational system, because that is the machine that churns out every 6 years in primary school, every year in secondary school, universities, regenerating the society. And the question is, how do all those people who come out into the system, how do they think? What is a worldview? It is an interpretation of the world and a roadmap of how we make our way in the world. Each individual amongst us has a worldview. You have a lodestar that guides you, how you interpret reality, how you interpret your place in the world, and where are you coming from? Where are you going? How do you intend to get there? What is the value system that underpins your life? What is the strategy for achieving your ambitions? What is the knowledge system? How do you interpret knowledge? How do you absorb knowledge? These are the elements of a worldview. And as we have it for individuals, so we have it for nations or for countries. So it is this foundational issue that makes the tragedy of the collapse of Nigeria's education system so tragic. Because when you have a society where people are going through this type of system that is just very formalistic, but has no real quality attached to it, has no real financing backing it, has no real priority given to it, you are bringing out a society that is weaker and weaker in the way it thinks, because it lacks an ability to understand the world, to interpret it in a collective way, and to advance in the world. That is why we are poor. That is why we are divided by ethnicity and religion and all sorts of sectarian tendencies, because we think in small views, not in the context of a national worldview. So this is really foundational. That's why our values have collapsed, because the educational system, in addition to the home, which is supposed to inculcate these values in the children, is not functioning. So we cannot be surprised when the society is overrun by crime, by terrorism, by banditry, by corruption, and all sorts of challenges. It's because we have not, or we have lost any sense of a foundational worldview of the Nigerian state. I don't even think we ever had it, but at least we had a functional and strong educational system decades and decades ago, around independence and before independence, when we were under colonial rule. The collapse, educational systems are also important because, of course, they have an educational impact. They have an economic impact. That's what I was trying to say. And that economic impact comes from the skills that the educational system transmits into the children, the jobs that they get when they come out of schools, and the ability to earn and escape the poverty trap, the ability to create wealth, and the ability to have upward mobility in life. That's what education does. And this contributes to economic transformation, and it contributes to economic development more broadly. Because if you look at the societies that rule the world today, go and check their education systems. They transmit productive knowledge, what we call productive knowledge. And it is that productive knowledge that is critical for economic transformation. The ability to manufacture complex products with insight in a competitive way and export them to the world. The ability to have a diversified product space that makes you not to rely on one raw commodity for your foreign exchange. If you rely only on oil, when the price of oil drops, or if it coughs, you catch pneumonia. If it sneezes, you get pneumonia. So we're not able to be competitive in the world because our educational system is very weak. And then the third importance of the educational system for us is that it brings about better choices. It helps us to reduce intergenerational poverty. Look at the education of women, for instance. If women are educated, they make better choices for their kids in terms of health outcomes, in terms of sending them to school and things like that. But where education is not a priority, women, and then of course we have the population conundrum, because better education helps women and families to understand that you shouldn't be bringing children into the world that you don't have the economic wherewithal to take care of. And so you have Nigeria's population exploding. We are projected to be at 400 million people in Nigeria by 2050. And if you look at where we are and the trajectory at which we're going, where our GDP per capita has not moved the needle for almost 50 years, and you compare that with the GDP per capita of developing societies that Nigeria was at the same place with in 1960. But today, they're economic giants in the world. We're talking about South Korea, we're talking about Malaysia, we're talking about Singapore. Go and look at the educational system, go and look at the investments in education, and I'll come to that in a minute. Finally, education is foundationally important because it creates a more equitable and just society. When we're educated, we understand why we should respect the human rights of others. When we are educated, we understand what democracy means. And we can actually compete on the basis of ideas in an election rather than what today we call a democracy in Nigeria, which is basically a selectocracy, where you have a political class that is essentially a reigning monarchy. And the citizens, who are supposed to be their masters and their boss, are in fact their servants. And they maintain this contract, weaponizing the poverty of those citizens every 4-year cycle. So this, and therefore we create an inequitable society, we create an unjust society, and after some time it begins to breed resentment, and this leads to ideas about revolution, leads to ideas about uprisings, and that affects order and stability. But it is an inevitable historical outcome based on conditions that have been created by the collapse of the educational system. So these are some of the foundational reasons why I would say that education is really so foundational for us as a country. Let me say a word or two about comparative investments in education and the outcomes we have seen, because this is one of the things I was asked to speak about. And I begin here by recounting what a former, or I think a current deputy executive director of UNICEF said at the World Economic Forum recently. Yoka Brandt said, and I quote, "Investing in education isn't just the right thing to do, it's smart economics." The evidence shows that on average, each additional year of education boosts a person's income by 10% and increases a country's GDP by 18% when you multiply that across individuals who get education. And so let's look at the Western countries or the OECD countries and compare that with the situation we have in Nigeria today. If you look at these countries, over a period of 100 years, from about 1870 to about 1993, most of them, had massive increases in public expenditure, public education expenditure. And the share of education as a share of expenditure on education as a portion of the GDP increased over time. So you have, for example, a country like Norway, education expenditure, public expenditure on education is about 9% of the GDP of Norway. The United States, it's about 7%. In France, it's 5.8%. In UK, it's 5.4% of GDP. Germany, it's 4.8% of GDP. And in Spain, it's 4.7% of GDP. These are OECD countries. Let's look at some low and middle income countries. In Brazil, which is a middle income country, the share of public expenditure on public education to GDP is 5.6%. In Colombia, it's 4.8%. In Ethiopia, which is a low income country, it's 4.7%. And I want to note that it is not a coincidence that the GDP per capita of Ethiopia has been moving up progressively over the last 20 years. In India, it's 3.3%, and in Pakistan, it's 2.3%. Let's look at South Korea. In South Korea, in the 40 years between 1970 and 2010, South Korea doubled its mean years of schooling from 6 years to 12 years. And in that same period, South Korea increased its GDP per capita drastically and significantly. The GDP per capita in South Korea in 1970 was $279. The GDP per capita in South Korea in 2019 was $31,000. This is going on in correlation with investments in public education. We've seen significantly improved health outcomes, especially a massive drop in child mortality. And then we come back to good old Nigeria. Where are we? Our 2021 budget is 13.08 trillion naira. And education is 742.5 billion, 5.6% allocated to education. And this is the lowest allocation to education since 2011. So it's as if as the years go by, we're spending less and less on education. That tells you that there's just no priority, regardless of speeches, regardless of official statements. It's what you do. It's how you allocate your resources that shows what your real priorities are. So our priorities are social intervention program and all sorts of programs that actually don't do anything because they're not addressing foundational factors that create poverty, including the education system. So we have a real problem. We have a real problem in Nigeria. When we don't invest in education, what are we doing? We are basically feeding an unemployment factory in Nigeria. What happens is that those who go through schools in Nigeria, they just come out and go into a long line of unemployment. So the schools basically are just pipelines into unemployment. That's what education in Nigeria today has essentially become to a very large extent. There are exceptions, of course, but the rule is far more dominant. And all this is because of lack of investment, because the young people in Nigeria, the youth, they are not being taught job creating skills that if you have, or if you can create venture capital support for them, will create businesses and create jobs. So I've given you a sense of the investment universe comparatively. The question then is, what do we do? We need to remember as a basic policy foundation that UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, recommends that the spending from the budget of every country every year should be at least between 15 to 20% of the budget should be spent on education. And you can see that Nigeria is very far away from this. South Africa's budget for education was 21% of its budget, I think its last budget. So you compare 21%, you compare 5% for Nigeria, and you can understand why the babies are crying. I think the education system in Nigeria requires a real Marshall Plan. But in Nigeria, I don't know what we understand the Marshall Plan to mean. We like to throw money at problems in Nigeria, and those problems never get solved because the quality of your spending matters. What you're spending money on matters. Most of the budget for education in Nigeria goes to recurrent expenditure. It doesn't go to capital expenditure in education. Educational infrastructure, educational equipment, creating a proper learning environment, that is not anybody's concern. But lots of contracts are being awarded from this little measly 5%. So when I say that education reform requires more money, we have to bear this in mind. I'm not talking about just continuing in the old ways, but educational reform that is foundational, in my view, has to have a number of elements, at least 7 elements. The first, of course, which I said is the UNESCO recommendation that we try to spend 15 to 20% of our budget on education. But what should we be spending on? The other priority we should be spending on is teacher training. We have to completely retrain all the teachers in primary schools and in secondary schools in Nigeria. That should be a primary focus because it's garbage in, garbage out. It's what the teacher who is not qualified is teaching our children that determines the kinds of children that we produce. With I think it was Chiche that spoke about people coming out of primary school in Enugu State. And by the way, we have a problem when we are talking about out of school children. It's increasingly a phenomenon in Igbo land, increasingly, where you now have mostly girls going to schools and a lot of boys are dropping out because they're going into business, because they're going into trading, or just trying to help their families to survive. So this is something that should be of huge concern to us. So teacher training requires massive investment, massive political will, massive attention from policy makers. The second thing that we have to do is that we have to invest in curriculum reform. We have to update our curriculum, which is very outdated. And again, I think someone mentioned that. But what should we be updating it to, or what should we be reforming the curriculum to? I recommend a very clear move towards vocational skills, a very clear move towards technology, a very clear move towards entrepreneurship, that the curriculum should be more of these things. If we look at Asia, rising Asia, they have retooled the educational system to invest more in science and technology, to invest more in vocational skills and in entrepreneurship. It's not because history and philosophy are not important. It's not because the liberal arts are not important. They are. But you see, when you are down and you need to break a cycle in a quick period, like the Chinese did in 40 years, going from poverty to becoming the world's second biggest economy, you have to take you have to make some hard choices. So those subjects are important and they should still be in the curriculums. But the point I'm making is that we have to invest a lot more in the kind kind of curriculum that makes our kids very productive when they come out of schools, very practical things. So we had the 6334 system from the 1980s, but it was never implemented very well. And that's because we did not have the teacher manpower to implement it. And so that goes back to teacher training. If you don't have kids who can say, when you come to, after 3 years of secondary school, you're a technical person, you move in this direction. You're more of an arts person, you move in this direction. But those teachers don't even have the training to make that happen. Then you've just created a system in theory that cannot work. So I think we need to reform how we teach. That is also a part of educational reform. You know, we train our children a lot in rote learning, cram and pour. But that is not how societies that are very innovative learn to a very large extent. Here in the United States, for example, in my class when I was a professor at Tufts University, if I'm teaching you, 60% of your grades come from your original research work. 60%. And that has to come in the form of a paper. 20% comes from your presentation and leadership and participation in class. 20% is your attendance. That's how I arrange my own courses. And so there is an emphasis on bringing out things from you. You are discovering, the student himself or herself is discovering things. And I think that's the way we should go. We need to invest in educational infrastructure. And educational infrastructure includes the physical environment in which our kids learn, learning aids. There's no reason why public schools in Nigeria, whether federal government owned or state government owned, should not have a laptop for every child. This is the 21st century. You cannot learn without using computers. You cannot learn without even understanding computer science. You can't access the world anymore without going through computers. In addition to the good old books, which of course, again, you don't even see them well-stocked. There are no well-stocked libraries. That is part of the educational infrastructures we also should have. Then you have the matter of teacher pay and restoring the prestige of education. The reason why countries like Finland and South Korea they have the best educational systems in the world, even better than countries like America, is because in those countries, there is a sociological prestige attached to teaching, to the profession of teaching, the way it used to be in our country in the colonial era. Onye nkuzi, the teacher, had prestige, even though he or she didn't have money. But everybody looked up to the teacher. Today, that is gone. The people who go into teaching are the people who couldn't get into anything else. They may have tried to get into university or polytechnic and they couldn't, then they go to a college of education. So then they go to a college of education and come out, their heart and their mind is not there. It's not what they would have liked to be doing. So the sociological underpinning around education, the prestige, the culture of education is even more important than the actual processes of education in societies that are doing well. So this is something we should invest in, in increasing and improving teacher pay and restoring the prestige of education. Then we also must invest, finally, in strengthening regulatory oversight. There is no regulation of education in Nigeria today. And any industry, including even education, that is not regulated, that is not supervised from a regulatory standpoint, standards will drop. And there'll be no consequence for the drop in standards. The way we regulate banks, when I was deputy governor of Central Bank and I was in charge of regulating 17 trillion naira banking industry, because they're holding other people's money. And 80%, most people don't know it, 80% of the money that banks use to do business is the depositors' funds. It's not the shareholders' funds. The shareholders start the thing. And then it's the depositors' funds that swell the bank's assets. So, and liabilities. So, but we regulate the banks and the financial industry very, very carefully. But we do not regulate the sector that actually builds up the society. It's totally neglected. There used to be inspectors of schools. I don't know if we still have them now. And if we have them now, they're not active because we don't see their impact and their consequence. An inspector of schools, when he or she should come on an inspection, that should have important consequences for the school. So these are some of the things I think we should invest in terms of education reform. When we're talking about education reform, I want us to be specific about what we mean by reforming education. It's not just to increase the budget. You can increase the budget by another 5% and you get to 10% of your budget for education or 15%, but it's still going into the wrong things. Some people are getting rich, but the education system is not actually improving. Let me conclude with a few words on the role of the government, the role of the private sector, and as alumni associations such as the CIC. What is the role of the government in education? In a society like Nigeria, a developing country, we cannot afford what is happening today, where the only decent education is coming from private institutions. Because, as I said in the beginning, this creates massive inequities. The people who can access education now are only the kids of rich kids or middle-class homes. And we find a lot of people who cannot even afford this kind of education, stretching themselves just so that their children can get a half-decent education instead of sending them to a public school. I am an alumnus of Government College Umuahia. When the CIC grows up, you will be like Government College of old when you grow up. but today, CIC is far better. The CIC of today and the CIC and the Government College of of today, you cannot compare. And I have to be honest. The CIC of today, look at what you guys are doing. We have closed down Government College of It's closed. And we set up an educational trust that took it over to reform the whole school. We just closed it down. I went there in 2018, I think when I was campaigning for the presidency. I went to the school, I wept. I wept. I couldn't believe that this was Government College Umuahia, founded in 1929, that produced Chinua Achebe and so many others. I think Chris Okibo actually also went to Government College. Patrick, is that correct?
Yes, he did.
Yes,
and Bede
exactly.
as well.
Exactly. And so many other, literary figures, So, but anyhow, we've closed down Government College Umuahia. So the government must return to its role in education. The government cannot, abdicate its responsibility for educating the society and hide under the fact that it is running a universal basic education program for primary school and the first 3 years of secondary. That's not enough because even the primary school education, the quality is horrible. But its responsibility goes across the whole of the education system. And therefore, private education should only be a small part of the educational system in a developing society like Nigeria. Because if the government does not provide quality education, then you have very serious problems of just the quality of the society as a whole, because those who can afford private education are relatively few. So the state must return to its predominant role, but it doesn't mean it is the only one that has a role. Chiche talked about what happened in Anambra State with the churches taking over schools and things like that, some schools. So the government can have partners. The private sector has a role to play. Endowments are not only for private schools. They should also include public schools. Let me give you a sense of college endowments, university endowments in the United States. The endowment of Harvard University, which is private, is $40 billion. That's more than Nigeria's external reserves. This is the endowment of a university, the investment fund. Yale has an endowment of $30 billion. Stanford has an endowment of $27 billion. Princeton has an endowment of $25 billion. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has an endowment of $17 billion. These are investments in education, and you see what they're doing with the research and the innovation that is going on and coming out of these universities and being applied to the economy and to society. The University of Pennsylvania, Penn, $14 billion. Texas A&M, $12 billion. University of Michigan, Texas A&M and the University of Michigan are public schools. But University of Michigan has an endowment of $12 billion. And then you have Notre Dame, $11 billion, and Columbia University, $10 billion. These are the top 10 universities in America in terms of endowment. The University of California system, which is a public school, also is quite heavily endowed. I don't have the figure right now with me. So the fact that it's government owned doesn't mean that alums cannot contribute the way the CIC is doing today. The private sector has a duty to give back a social responsibility to universities. When I was the deputy governor of the central bank, it was a bit controversial, but we intervened a lot in the educational system in Nigeria because we saw that it was collapsing. And so as corporate social responsibility, we intervened in universities, we intervened in schools, we built centers of excellence. I personally influenced the investment of 1 billion naira to build a twin hostel for Anambra State University in Igbariam. I intervened for an investment of 600 million naira at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University campus in Nnewi. So these were little things we did. But the problem of education is far deeper, because even if you help to build flashy new infrastructure, which can improve the quality of the educational experience, but if you're not addressing the teachers, the teacher training, then the foundational problem is not there. You have a nice glossy building, but the quality of education is still not what it should be. So I've tried to touch on a few things. I don't have a lot of time, but we have to just go back to basics as far as education in Nigeria is concerned. And let me now conclude with something we can never run away from: politics. You will never get the kind of education system you deserve if the political leadership of a country or of a state is not made up of, across the board, not just one person, but across the board, of intelligent people who themselves are educated and prioritize the value of education. If the worst are ruling the best, as is the case in Nigeria, how do you think that the education system can be reformed? It's not going to happen. In the Eastern region and in the Western region, let's take Awolowo, who had free education, which had a great impact in the Western region. And in the Southeast, where you had Nnamdi Azikiwe and M.I. Opara, again, they achieved great feats in education. It is because of the quality of these leaders. They were intellectuals. So a society that is not led by people with intellect or people who appreciate intellect can never reform it. In fact, the reason why Nigeria's educational system is going down and will continue to go down, I promise you, regardless of anything we're saying here, if the kind of leadership we have at the top, both at the central government and in the states, does not change, CIC alums will continue to carry almost 100% of the burden, instead of carrying maybe 30% of it, and the state should do its work. But it's because of the kinds of people we're electing. So we have to pay attention to these things. You know, we cannot say we're educated, but we worship our politicians who are basically power mongers, but they cannot govern. If they could govern, then we wouldn't be where we are. So we have to understand that the solutions to problems are deep. I issued a statement on the recession we've gone into, and I said, you can't solve Nigeria's economic problems without political solutions. Nigeria has to be foundationally, constitutionally restructured, because that is what is feeding, it creates the incentive for everybody to be looking at oil. So when we think we can solve things in compartments, it doesn't work out. The root of the matter is politics. And we all as citizens must go into that zone, whether as voters, whether as contestants, it doesn't matter. Whether as members of political parties, that's where the reforms begin, because that's the pipeline that produces the top level of leadership. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Moghalu. You've stirred the honestness, because I've got a flurry of questions for you.
Sure.
But we have just a few minutes to address all of them. So let me just go through and give you the questions, and you can address all of them in one go. Okay. So there's a question on how do we evolve this shared philosophy? So you started by talking about a worldview. So how do we evolve a shared philosophy for Nigeria?
Okay.
Number two, if we started today to fix things, and this is from strategy, how long would it take for the results to impact GDP? Yeah. Okay. So if we started from today, now there's a question from Mr. Onyebuchi, and it's a long question, but basically it's asking, between political will and economic focus on now. Yeah?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
There's a question from Mr. Ike. Okay, between political will and economic resolve, which should we focus on? Political will and economic resolve.
Okay, all right. Sure. Go ahead. Uh-oh, we lost him.
Looks like we've lost Okibo.
Okay, I think the best thing is for me to be addressing.
I'm back now. Let me just go through. So there's a question on, should we, in the short term, bring in import teachers? Should we, in the short term, import teachers from, say, Pakistan, India, whatever, just to plug the shortfall? And there is a question. Okay, I think you've answered this question. Without access to proper ICT equipment in our schools, we can't bring our students that can compete globally in the 21st century. What do you recommend as a starting point for public schools? And this is the question.
All right, Prof, I think you can just progress.
Okay.
My else is going on and off.
Okay, all right. Let me very briefly address the questions. Number one, the question of a foundational worldview for the Nigerian state. This is a task, for leadership, because every society's worldview is shaped by the people who lead it politically. If you look at the United States, for example, and you see the role that the founding fathers played in establishing the American worldview, that America is a special country, it's God's own country, a land of the free, home of the brave, God's own country, and so on and so forth. You will see that and you had the founding fathers who were philosophers, like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. They were intellectuals. And so there was a clash of ideas, massive clash of ideas at the founding of the United States. And you had intellectual arguments represented in the Federalist Papers, arguments between Thomas Jefferson, between Alexander Hamilton, who wrote about 70% of the Federalist Papers, and people like John Jay, and so on. So if you don't elect intelligent leaders, you can never get a societal worldview, because it's never the citizens who create that philosophical foundation. It is created by the leaders, and then it is inculcated and educated in the citizens. And that educational process goes through the educational system. So for example, in America, when you go through primary school or secondary school, by the time you're out, you already have a certain worldview as an American. You salute the flag. You know what the flag means. You believe that America is just bigger and better than everywhere else in the world. Worldviews are not always objective. Let me be very clear. They can be subjective, but when they're consistently applied, they establish realities. Slavery was based on a worldview of the superiority of the Caucasian race, but that worldview was overthrown by the emancipation and the struggle for freedom. So worldviews may last for a century or two or three. Sometimes they get overtaken by other, contending worldviews. But the place to begin is, who is your leader? Who are you voting for? That's the bottom line. If you're voting for somebody who says, I'll be there blowing grammar, you will never get a worldview, because the man is telling you, or the woman is telling you, that he or she doesn't care about intellect. Anytime I see anybody saying you're blowing grammar, those are the worst enemies of Nigeria. Because every country that is making progress is led by men and women blowing serious grammar. That's a fact. And that is why I'll never apologize in my political persona for being an intellectual. I will never apologize for it, because I know that societies that have made progress are led by intellectuals. So who are you voting for? That's where the matter of the worldview begins. If you're voting for people with the capacity to establish such a worldview and disseminate it to the citizens through an educational system that functions, then you're on your way. How long will fixes take to impact GDP? This is something that will not happen overnight, but it will happen over a few years. If you take 2 or 3 or 4 years and reform the Nigerian educational system from top to bottom, just radically reform it, maybe over a period of 4 years, you will see that in another 4 or 5 years, you will begin to see the impact. You will begin to feel the impact in the economy. And if you have, let's say, I always say, how long will it take to fix Nigeria? Quite apart from the restructuring of Nigeria, which is absolutely necessary and foundational. If Nigeria is run by capable leaders for 16 years, 8 years in one go for 4 years, and another 8 years for 4. 16 years is enough. You will not recognize this country. And it is possible and it is doable. Political will versus economic resolve. This is a chicken and egg. The problem with saying, forget politics, focus on the economy, is that the economy is the product of political decisions and political institutions. If you read Why Nations Fail, for example, you will see the importance of political institutions as a foundation for economic growth. It is when you have free and strong political institutions that they can establish powerful or strong economic institutions. When I was at the central bank, it was a strong institution, and we contributed our quota. Today, there are people who will tell you they have a very different view of the central bank because it has gone into prosecuting peaceful protesters. And they'll call you financiers of terrorism. Is that an independent institution? They are now aligned with the regime, with the state, instead of being independent and making independent economic policy. So, and that's because of the nature of the leadership at the political level, which does not respect or believe that there should be any institution of the government that can be independent of Aso Rock. So it all comes back to what I'm saying. Now, there are entrepreneurs who do well. The young tech entrepreneurs, those who survive the SARS forces, they can do well, but they're not doing well because of the government or because of the policies of the state. They're doing well in spite of. So imagine how well they would have done if the political or public policy or governance environment was much better. So you would have seen, you can imagine the stupendous amount of wealth that will be created in this country that has so many millions of innovative citizens. but you have to create an enabling environment. What is the intellectual property policy of the government? Are inventions being encouraged by pipelining them into the market? Do you go into a shop and see inventions by young Nigerians? But we know they're inventing every day. And they take photographs of them and put it in the newspapers. We are proud of them. That's the last you will hear of the story. So I come back again to the political will, I believe, is primary. Should we import teachers to plug shortfalls? I think we can, but what we need is to import teachers who will be trainers. I think if you import a number of teachers from wherever you want to bring them in and you pay them well, and to begin a massive overhaul of the educational system at the federal level for all the educational system under the federal government, and state governors can do that for their own states, secondary and primary, you will get somewhere. So I don't think we can do this, teacher retraining just on our own, because we have produced so many years and even decades of mediocrity in the whole teaching universe. Who's going to train who? Only 43% of university teachers in Nigeria have a PhD, which is the minimum, which should be the minimum to teach in a university. So many people are teaching without a PhD, So you have some fundamental problems. Then finally, ICT for public schools. Number one, governments should invest in this as part of their education budget or part of increasing their education budget. In the meantime, until they do, universities or schools, secondary schools, can approach non-profit organizations around the world. There are many in the United States. So maybe this is a job for CIC alone. There are people who are giving away computers. Look, a laptop used in America that is 3 or 4 years old or 5 years old, nobody here wants to touch it. But if you bring it to CIC, it will transform the lives of your students. So there are networks and partnerships that can be created for mass reception as corporate social responsibility or as aid. I don't believe in foreign aid, but in this particular instance, it can work and it can help. So that's my sense. So it's a two-pronged attack. Get the government to do its work, but in the meantime, you can reach out to organizations around the world that have computers to give away. And I know that there are many.
Maybe one or two more questions, although we're almost out of time. There's a question from Mr. Ebel. What's your view regarding our current academic curriculum in primary and secondary schools? Do you think a single curriculum should be enforced by us cross-board? Chukwemeka Benbosa, how do you balance the available resources with the investments that need to be made to bring the necessary changes we speak of? He goes on to say in an essay he wrote in the late 1970s, he posited that planning is a technical matter while implementation is a political matter. In Nigeria, we have had lots of very good plans which unfortunately have not been implemented. How can you at the micro level begin the changes to bring the right, to set Nigeria right?
Yeah.
A few more questions.
Okay.
From Chibo, having had the opportunity to study both in Nigeria and the UK, it is clear that the educational system and orientation needs total overhaul. Top universities in the UK have massive endowments and research grants available to them, whereas in Nigeria, most, if not all, universities depend on non-interested federal government for funding. Surely this will not take us anywhere. And a few other comments, but let me leave you with those questions.
Okay. The question of academic curriculum, I think, we can, in terms of the federal government, let's say federal secondary schools, I think they should have a broadly similar academic curriculum. There should be minimum standards. That's the thing. It's not that there must be 100% standard curriculum, but there must be minimum standards. And that's what I mean. For example, if you say that every school in Nigeria must teach certain subjects, every school must teach history. A nation that does not know its history is not can never become a nation. It can be only a country, but it can never be a nation. Every school must teach technology, science and technology. Every school must teach vocational skills. Every school must teach entrepreneurship. So if you have these basics, you can work with it. There may be variations here and there, but I believe that broadly, there should be a similarity of curriculums in a country. It targeted at producing the type of pool of employment that you want to see as a matter of policy, public policy and strategy. Someone talked about, education, how do we balance resources? Well, I mean, I talked about that. I mean, if you're spending 5% of your budget on education, you're not serious. That's what it means. Now, how do you get, and the person talked about planning is technical, implementation is political. So if the implementation is not happening, what should we do as citizens? Maybe that is what should be the subject of the next protest, peaceful protest. And then maybe they'll wake up. Yeah. So
one last question.
Sure.
One last question. It's from Nnamdi Madekwe. Restructuring is great, but our leaders in the Southeast have done nothing to improve health and education in the Southeast. Must we wait on restructuring an Igbo presidency to make progress as a region? Why are political leaders not so motivated to engage with the alums of the institutions to do the lifting and improving of educational standards because of fund deficit? This is a standard in advanced economies with capacity. So basically, should we be waiting for Igbo presidency or restructuring before the local leadership in the region engages?
No, we should not. While we keep fighting for restructuring, while we keep the pressure for a Nigerian president of Igbo extraction, because we are also citizens of Nigeria, and the two things are not mutually exclusive. I laugh when I see people saying, "Oh, don't waste your time on Igbo presidents. What we need is restructuring." All of them matter. All of them matter. Why should you leave the presidency to anybody else? Does it stop you from arguing for restructuring? In fact, you need a president who believes in restructuring before Nigeria can actually be restructured. So at the end of the day, the two are actually joined. Now, when you're talking about what should happen at the local level, you don't have to, we can hold our politicians, our leaders, our policymakers in the states and local governments accountable. This comes down to the citizens and the ability of citizens to stand up for what they demand in a democracy. Look at countries in the Western world that are democracies. You will always see peaceful protests. It's actually part of the fabric of democracy. You will see people coming out heavily in the newspapers, on television, forming groups, pressure groups. Things don't move forward just automatically. Human beings are not perfect, even in America and Britain and Canada. Their citizens keep the policymakers and their political people on their toes. So we as citizens have abdicated our functions in Igbo land and in Nigeria more broadly. And I think we need to begin to organize more effectively to demand accountability from our local leaders, the governors of the 5 states of the Southeast. They need to step up to the plate, and we need to, because in the Southwest, they are not waiting. They're arguing for restructuring, but they're moving ahead with DAWN, the development agenda for Western Nigeria. They're doing both at the same time. And I think we must learn to do that in Igbo land.
Excellent. And I think we've really run out of time. So let me thank you for making time to be with us, and sharing your thoughts with us. We forgive you that you didn't get the blessing of being a Semper, but this association today has bestowed on you, some of those blessings. And so on behalf of the organizers and the leadership of the Alumni Association, I thank you most profoundly, for making time to be with us.
Thank you. It's my honor, my pleasure. Yeah, I greet you all. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah.